Sega 32X now available. Purchase while supplies last. Be sure to check local retailers like Kmart. The 32X was a unique experiment. It was a device that offered the end user a powerful expansion for their home console. But nothing else in gaming history is either so hated or loved, and it is often seen as the moment when the giant that was Sega began to stumble and crumble in the face of rising adversaries. Even before the console was released, many gamers were confused by it. They were unsure of what it would really do for them as consumers. But this is a story of the 32X, and how it represented one of the single greatest joint ventures between Sega of Japan and Sega of America, and its ultimate failure, marking the beginning of the end of Sega's home console business. The story of the 32X is not what we've been led to believe. The entire story is actually a much deeper and more complex affair. Its history, as we now know, is a convoluted mosaic of stories. It paints a tiled image with certain aspects of the story being visible, and others being foggy and less well represented. Today, the story that is widely accepted is not the entire truth, or at the very least, isn't the entire story. We now have the benefit of a more complete mosaic, with new stories and information highlighting the parts of the story that were previously unknown. History is never a clear lens from which to view the past. Even when looking back only 30 years, it is often fogged by our limited knowledge and perspective of events. The true beauty of history is that it's always being added to. The lens we use to look back is always being shined and improved with added knowledge. This is gathered by people with true passion for the subject. People are tirelessly working to preserve and record history. People like MD Shock and the Sega Saturn Shiro channel are thankfully here today, continuing to add new and exciting information that challenges our existing understanding of gaming history. History is always changing with new and exciting information from which to better understand the past. The purpose of this video will be to explore the history of the 32X as it pertains to the American and Japanese perspective, as well as exploring the rationale for the 32X's existence, along with exploring the reasons for its eventual failure.
New Sega Genesis.
Across America.
Alright, baby.
Increase the...
Gotta go.
Hey, guy, you're the first serious gamer I've seen all morning. Check this out. Brand new 16-bit Super Nintendo with Super Mario World. Wow!
Oh, what's this one?
Oh, this is a Sonic the Hedgehog from Sega Genesis.
The story of the 32X should be looked at from two perspectives, the Japanese and American. That being said, the stories between Sega of America and Sega of Japan deviate. At the time of the 32X's creation, Sega of America existed somewhat independent from SOJ, at least in the managerial sense. That independence coming from Tom Kalinski's perceived success with the Genesis, that had just captured 50% of the North American market, giving Sega of America some leeway in their operations. But the story of the 32X is an interesting one, as it seems in recent years there has been a considerable attempt by both SOA and SOJ managers to distance themselves from the console. As success has many fathers, but failure will always be an orphan. So as a result, the two stories are somewhat at odds with each other. But when you look at them together, the entire picture becomes a bit more clear. They begin to fit together and show us a collection of events that actually shaped the birth and eventual death of the 32X.
"32X Genesis and so separate."
Sega of America's version of the story is that the 32X had its literal genesis on January 8, 1994, on the eve of the Winter Electronics Show in Las Vegas. A meeting was held between high-ranking Sega of America and Sega of Japan staff. Hayao Nakayama had mandated that a 32-bit cartridge-based system be developed and brought to market before Christmas of 1994. The initial idea was that the system would be a standalone Genesis Type 2 system that would be a Genesis with improved graphics and functionality. However, Joe Miller, head of Sega of America's research and development, didn't like that idea and stated a counterthought to the idea of a standalone console. The Ultimate History of Video Games states that Joe Miller said, "Oh, that's just a horrible idea. If all you're going to do is enhance the system, you should make it an add-on," he said. "If it's a new system with legitimate new software, great, but if the only thing it does is double the colors." After a long discussion about this prospect, Sega Japan's Hayao Nakayama had dictated that Joe Miller's add-on idea would be Sega's game plan going forward. Only the key difference this time with 32X development would be that Sega of America would be brought into the fold for the development, instead of the system being solely done by Sega of Japan.
A system with twice the power, twice the intelligence, twice the talent, twice the fun.
So this was a rare opportunity for Sega of America to show that they could push hardware, as well as Sega of Japan.
And finding out about the new games you're working on. See, Savage, Game Beat. Thank you for emailing Sega. Your message is being forwarded.
Joe Miller later spoke to Sega16.com and spoke a bit about the birth of the 32X, giving a bit more context to the system's creation. Hideki Sato was right there with us, and I don't want to rehash history. I certainly don't want to rewrite it either, because there's been a lot said about it, about what exactly transpired there. Just let me put it this way. At CES, and perhaps we even had a little warning before CES, it became clear that there was a desire for us to take a product that was in the early design stages in Japan. It was a new platform. Nobody was codenaming things Jupiter then, or even Mars at that point. And there was certainly an awareness that Japan had an idea of what they wanted to do with the Genesis platform, that had more colors and was able to do 3D. Take some of what we learned on the SVP chip, the Polygon Pusher chip, and integrate something that was more capable and build a new platform. It was still going to be a 16-bit machine, with some limited 32-bit capabilities.
Or have a few words with Sonic himself. Wouldn't you?
32X makes processing power 40 times faster. Totally extreme gameplay.
Computers and computer programming. Real thing. Now this is a game that's in an early stage.
So, Joe Miller became the father of the 32X. But the way the story is told, it's that he had to pick one choice from two different bad choices. Miller pushed for the design that ended up being more powerful than the original modified Genesis 2 idea, and ultimately released something that offered a powerful budget option versus the later Saturn and PlayStation, however, in a rather complex package. This is all the rationale we're ever really given in the West to the birth of the 32X, so the story in a way places the blame on Nakayama for the 32X coming into existence. But based on some interviews that have come out from the Japanese side of the house, we now know there was more going on with the idea of the 32X, and SOA had more to do with this idea than just being told to do it. We know that Joe Miller stated he had been given wind of the 32X idea a bit before CES, which leads into Irimajiri's retelling of the 32X's birth, shining more light onto that statement from Joe Miller.
Hey! You still don't have a Sega CD? What are you waiting for, Nintendo to make one?
Sega Japan's story is a tad more collaborative, with Shoichiro Imajiri presenting a different take on the birth of the 32X, given in an interview from 2022. The early development of the Saturn was a troubling time for Sega, as the Saturn design still wasn't finalized when Imajiri came into Sega in July of 1993. So, at that time, the design for the Saturn just hadn't been decided, and they were fighting between going with a 2D specialization versus 3D graphics. But ultimately, the Sony PlayStation development kits decided to focus on 3D for the Saturn, and the hardware changes were made to counter it. However, Sega Japan was sitting in third place with the Genesis in Japan, and they were ready to abandon it in favor of moving to the next console. Sega of America, on the other hand, wasn't so keen on leaving the aging Genesis behind. Irimajiri, shortly after coming on board at Sega, went to Sega of America and had a meeting with Tom Kalinske and Joe Miller. Joe Miller and Tom Kalinske made a passionate case to Irimajiri about how they couldn't just abandon the Genesis in favor of a new console, as the Genesis was still selling.
Just as I entered Sega, there was a huge debate about whether it was okay to release the Saturn as it was, with its limited 3D capabilities. it was decided we had no choice but to increase the 3D capabilities. At the absolute minimum, the Saturn had to be able to handle the 3D graphics of Sega's fighting game Virtua Fighter. That was impossible on the Saturn as it then was. To put it in simple terms, the Saturn's CPU could not handle the heavy processing required to create the 3D graphics. A possible solution was to add a GPU, a graphics chip, that could specialize in handling the heavy graphics calculations. However, it was far too late to begin development on something like that, so it was decided to use a second Hitachi SH2 CPU in place of a GPU. The architecture of the Saturn was revised to include 2 SH2s, and that's how the Saturn was released. So in Japan, the 3D capabilities of the Saturn were boosted. However, in America, they didn't want to go in that direction. The Genesis had been so successful, and third parties were still in the middle of developing games for it. Therefore, before releasing a next-generation 3D-capable console, they wanted to release an enhancer for the Genesis that would boost its capabilities. This is where things got messy. Since we wouldn't be able to release the Saturn in America, I was told to go there and help resolve the situation. I had just joined Sega at the beginning of July 1993, and by the middle of July, I flew out to Sega of America. I still didn't have a good understanding of the game industry, so I was just going to listen to what they had to say. Shoichiro Irimajiri, MDShock.com.
超えたスケールとアクションで息もつかせぬ面白さ。超ハラハラ超ドキドキの超速アクション。ソニック・ザ・ヘッジホッグ2。Welcome to Sonic Land。メガドライブから世界へ向けて。
Irimajiri returned to Japan to continue discussing the idea of supporting the Genesis for longer, or at the very least releasing something that would support the Genesis user base for a continued period of time. Irimajiri blames his inexperience with the game industry at that point in time, as he was new to Sega, having come from the automotive industry. However, Irimajiri felt the points Sega of America were making were worth giving some actual thought. Irimajiri stated in that interview that Sega of America were the ones who wanted to pursue something that would enhance the capabilities of the Genesis, which that statement alone challenges what we know about the 32X story. The difference between the stories. The first major difference between SOA and SOJ's story is the timeline. Mid-July of 1993 is when Irimajiri states that he had his initial meeting with SOA regarding prolonging the life of the Genesis with a potential enhancer. The American side of the story begins on January 1994, with Nakayama's decree to make the 32X an add-on. So we have a difference in time and space between the two stories, at least in terms of when the whole thing started. But that can tie into Joe Miller's story as well, because he stated that he had gotten wind of the project a little bit before CES. So a time frame of a couple of months lag between that initial meeting with Irimajiri and that eventual meeting at CES would explain it. And the eventual CES meeting was the trigger that finally launched the 32X into being.
You are approaching Saturn.
Ultimately, this raises more questions about prior statements made by other YouTube historians, saying that SOA wasn't fully aware of the Saturn and were kept in the dark to its development, which seems to be relatively untrue, with Sega of America pushing for the add-on, as at that time it was pretty clear that the American market wouldn't get the Saturn for at least a year after the Japanese launch, and ultimately, even longer if they wanted to have a successful launch with enough stock to maintain retailer relationships. But the notion of being kept in the dark was probably more to do with Sega of Japan changing the design of the Saturn from a 2D powerhouse to more of a 3D powerhouse in response to the PlayStation, which might have caused some problems. But something else that was found is that from the Japanese perspective, the system wasn't Sega of Japan's idea being pushed on SOA because of Nakayama's fear of the Jaguar. While the Jaguar was a potentially powerful console on the horizon, I doubt Sega was focused on it, as they were gearing up to counter the PlayStation, with the Jaguar connection probably coming from an interview with Joe Miller stating that the 32X was primarily against the Jaguar initially. And this is an interview in 2001 when Joe Miller said this. The moment of technical victory. If not a sales victory, but a technical victory. I'm an engineer, with the 32X was a turning point in the gaming industry. It was a culmination of relentless dedication and innovation from our team. As the news of our success spread, there was a profound shift in the gaming landscape. The realization that we had surpassed the Jaguar ignited a sense of pride and accomplishment among the team. But we also knew that this was just the beginning of a new era. There was a specific moment during a team meeting when we were discussing the growing popularity of the 32X and the declining sales of the Jaguar. Emotions ran high, and it became apparent, or it seemed at the time, that we were charting a new course in gaming history. When the 1994 holiday numbers came in by fax on the 28th of December, we were in the boardroom. Well, Kalinske was conferenced in, and a few people laughed, a few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Kojiki scripture. Nakayama is trying to persuade the Emperor that he should do his duty, and to impress him, takes on his multi-console form and says, "Now, I am become 32-bit, the destroyer of Jaguar." I suppose we all thought that, one way or another. The long-lost Joe Miller interview, reddit.com, provided by user CowGod180. The 2001 interview leads me to connect that because of the passionate nature of the discussion about the Jaguar, it may have led to some stories crossing over and making later authors think that the two were connected. Ultimately, in a Sega 16 interview with Joe Miller, and it regarding the birth of the 32X, the Jaguar isn't mentioned once. What could be the main takeaway from Sega of Japan and Sega of America stories? They're both probably true, in the sense that the meeting between Arimajiri and Sega of America happened in July, and then several months later, Nakayama had his meeting with Joe Miller, finally pulling the trigger on the console, after Sega of Japan had hammered out the logistics on their end, to see if such a feat was possible. Also, there was a fair amount of discussion in the gaming magazines of the era after the launch of the 32X, where Tom Kalinske came to the defense of the 32X with some of the prior talking points mentioned in that initial meeting between SOA and SOJ. Tom Kalinske firmly believed in the 32X as a concept for moving forward. The technology of the 32X happens to be good. The price point is so important in the US market that how good it is really doesn't matter. We've got to have a product out there that the consumer can afford to buy in Walmart, Target, Sears, and all these other places. The thought, let's upgrade the 16-bit Genesis they already own to a 32-bit experience, was the most logical one to us. Tom Kalinske, Next Generation Magazine. But what we now know is that the idea was far more collaborative, and both sides, Sega of Japan and Sega of America, wanted to work together in creating something that would be a new and innovative way to tap into the existing Genesis user base, as well as deal with the logistical shortfalls they were going to face when they tried to get the Saturn into the US market. So, when you combine the stories, you get a much clearer picture and can begin to explain the choices both sides of the house made. But it also begins to highlight where the oversights were made that led to the 32X's failure, and how it signaled an even rougher period ahead for Sega. The idea, while primarily Sega of America's, wasn't entirely theirs alone, as Sega of Japan had been working on an idea for a new standalone upgraded Genesis because of how badly it had performed in the Japanese market. The idea, however, made Joe Miller respond with the add-on concept, as it allowed the American market to take advantage of the install base of the Genesis. While history likes to blame Sega of Japan for the 32X, both sides of the house wanted to move forward with this project and were at least initially invested in getting the 32X out the door. The story we've been told wasn't the entire story, and the 32X, in a sense, is a more beautiful moment in Sega's history, as it was collaborative and marked the moment in time when both Sega of Japan and Sega of America respected each other's ideas and tried something that was quite different.
CPU 搭載限界のバリアをぶち破って見せる
The 32X ultimately answered a few logistical questions for Sega that they were facing on the eve of the Saturn's birth. Sega of America knew that the Saturn was probably going to cost around $399, which at that time was believed to be suicide for a game console, as such a high price put the Saturn into the realm of hi-fi electronics. Shinobu Toyota commented on the price situation regarding the Saturn in the Mega Drive's collection book. Toyota talked about how Joe Miller pitched the idea for the 32X in front of Nakayama, stating that if they used the guts of the Saturn, they could make something as good for half the cost, which at a lower price point would make it dramatically more competitive than $399, as that arena typically didn't gain nearly enough consumers to make the product like a game console viable, as the install base would be too small to make money off game sales. The 3DO and the Philips CDI suffered from their high price points. But the main advantage offered by the 32X was that it allowed them to take advantage of the Genesis install base of roughly 20 million users in North America, which from a marketing standpoint made a fair amount of sense. But something like that really hadn't been tried before, except with the Sega CD, which its sales performance was debatable at the price of $299 at launch, which could have influenced the idea of trying to sell the 32X as a less expensive add-on.
Danita Stokes, president of HAG.
It's bad enough that Sega Genesis has the most 16-bit games, but this new Sonic the
Another
Hedgehog...
discussion point for the 32X was something Joe Miller mentioned in a Sega 16 interview regarding how the 32X could be used as a jumping-off point for developers looking to move on to the Saturn, by getting them early exposure to the Hitachi SH2s. Our challenge, our focus, was to make sure we had documentation. We had compilers that were producing correct code, that the SH2 was optimized, that we had debuggers, hardware emulators, and a variety of other things. I don't think very many people understood the layers of infrastructure required to actually get developers up to speed on a new platform. One of the stories that hasn't been told is that 32X actually helped development teams that have been successful in the Genesis make the steps up to the Hitachi SH2, dual SH2s in that case. And there were a bunch of routines, a collection of tools and compilers that were created to support 32X development, that were adapted and ported over to the Saturn. The early launch meant that we had to accelerate all of that in the pipeline as well. All the cross-development tools, all the documentation, and get developers ramped up 6, 8, 12 months earlier than we had expected or intended. Joe Miller, Sega16.com.
People, this is not a test! We are at DEFCON 5. Alpha Sector. Check. Tango Sector. Check. Delta Sector.
The other argument for the 32X was that the Saturn just wouldn't be ready in time for the American market, in terms of its current development time and then the lead time required to get it up to production. The Saturn at that point was looking more like a late 1995 release. Sega Japan was planning to release the Saturn console at the end of 1994, at least in Japan. And it was thought that the 32X offered a stopgap to cover down on the American consumers until the Saturn was completely ready. According to Arimajiri, the Saturn's release would be postponed in North America in order to accommodate for the 32X's release. This was because there was a feeling at SOJ that they just couldn't produce enough Saturns to cover the American and Japanese markets, at least initially. But per Arimajiri, SOJ and SOA agreed on postponing the Saturn release by at least a year. And that was the deal. That was primarily the functional linchpin behind the 32X's plan, that it would hold over the American market while they waited for critical mass of Saturns. But as we'll find out later, that plan dramatically changed.
When you've got Sega Saturn, nothing else matters. Sega!
The tragedy of the 32X won't be because of its ultimate failure as a console, but that it was a truly collaborative moment within Sega. It had just about every corner of the company coming together to push the idea, a rare moment when the company seemed to agree on something truly outside the norm, with Sega of Japan allowing Sega of America to lead the charge. Nakayama went as far as to defend Sega's strategy on how they intended to launch two consoles in different markets, stating that ultimately, Sega would never know if a 50,000 yen console would sell unless they tried it. However, this somewhat united front, at least initially, was quickly beginning to be undermined by Sega's growing fears against its rivals, namely Sony, which triggered a serious decision that completely destroyed any chance the 32X actually had. The console's design and launch. What made the console a unique design is that add-ons for game console were pretty rare outside of Sega. The Sega CD boosted the system performance and offered game developers an immensely larger storage format for creating games. It wasn't, however, a huge success. Somewhere around 3 million units sold before being discontinued. While the Sega CD offered graphical improvements, it wasn't any massive type of generational leap, in the same way that the 32X claimed it would be for Genesis. While the 32X did offer some rather impressive graphical capabilities, it would ultimately never be a Sega Saturn. It boasted 32,768 on-screen colors, 50,000 polygons per second, with 256 kilobytes of RAM and 256 kilobytes of video RAM. Even with some impressive numbers on paper, there were some serious factors that had to be contended with. Sega of America worked hard to produce a prototype console, which was displayed at CES in June of 1994. That showing began hyping American consumers for what was on the horizon to come for the console. However, there were certainly mixed reactions at the time, with consumers growing concerned about the system coming out against Sega's own Sega Saturn, or Sega abandoning gamers who had invested in their other systems. Which ironically, that consumer concern actually made it onto a TV infomercial produced by Sega, Absolute Roastery, when they were conducting interviews talking about the idea of 32X. And Sega neglected to cut that out.
32X. What have you heard about the 32X adapter? The 32-bit, better graphics, real good sound, just more arcade games, more realistic games. I'm wondering, will Genesis die out? Yeah, I'm worried that they might make the Genesis games obsolete. I just wonder if they're going to carry on the line.
The hype around the 32X was a tad mixed, but when the system was shown to consumers at CES in the summer of 1994, people were very interested in the platform. When the 32X launched, it sold pretty well. However, that early momentum wasn't going to last. The games the system had at launch were Virtua Racing, Doom, Star Wars Arcade, and Cosmic Carnage, with the games being considered alright by general consumers. However, it was clear that the port of Doom had been rushed, and Cosmic Carnage wasn't anything special. Star Wars Arcade, however, turned out to be a pretty solid initial system seller. Sega had allocated 500,000 32Xs for the American launch, but retailers had ordered considerably more. However, those orders wouldn't last. But something else happened after the 32X launched on November 21st of 1994, was that the Saturn launched in Japan the day after on November 22nd, which despite being an ocean away, that was enough of a shockwave to sow doubts in the 32X's future with consumers and most importantly developers. Something really interesting and ultimately self-defeating is mentioned in the book Service Games. The development kits for the 32X and Saturn showed up at the same time, which caused a bit of confusion among developers, who reasonably looked at both systems and thought, why would I develop for the system that was less powerful? When it came to their bottom line, developers had a much easier choice to make. And in that situation, they were more inclined to work on the Saturn as it offered more power and was the next big thing. Other issues arose when general consumers had issues with their consoles and how they hooked up with the Genesis Model 1s and 2s, as some retailers didn't get the right hookups, resulting in claims that retailers tried to push consumers to buy newer Genesis systems to work on their 32Xs, which hurt consumer interest and trust in the product. The 32X was fighting more than just a battle against systems like the 3DO and Jaguar and the Super Nintendo. It was fighting a battle against time itself. As per the agreement with Sega of Japan, the Saturn was supposed to be pushed off at least a year before it was released in North America. However, that agreement changed.
You'll never find another place like mine. And the reason why? Hey, 32X.
Introducing Sega Saturn. Aww, hit it!
Sega of Japan forced Sega of America to launch the Saturn sooner than planned. The Saturn ended up being launched May 11th of 1995 to somewhat disastrous results, as Sega shorted retailers, resulting in some major chains dropping Sega. One of the major points of the 32X was that the Saturn would be delayed. With that change to the dynamic, there wasn't anything Sega could do to drive interest in the 32X, as it was effectively dead, as most gamers saw the 32X as a distraction to the real games that were going to be coming out on the Saturn. Despite the large price tag of the Saturn, it was clear that most consumers would move in that direction. What was even worse was that the 32X split the market, as gamers who had gotten the 32X felt abandoned. As the Saturn was released, and games for the 32X were trickling out, it was clear more resources were being shifted behind the Saturn, and the 32X was being left behind. The 32X would only be actively supported by Sega until about 1996, as by that point, Sega decided that all resources needed to be shifted behind the Saturn. During that 2-year span, it did manage to host about 40 32X titles, some of which utilized the system's unique capabilities to do some uniquely impressive arcade ports. However, with the gaming landscape quickly shifting away from the Genesis era of games, and the prior Sprite era-based arcade games, the 32X quickly fell behind as its 3D capabilities were never fully utilized at the time. The 32X briefly had a console standalone pitched, the Neptune, which was a Genesis 32X all-in-one. This idea was flirted with and briefly advertised, but ultimately left in the early prototype stages. While I'd love to tell you that the Neptune console could have turned the tide for the 32X, it however was a little too late. And Sega was hurting everywhere across the business in North America. Per Imagiri, despite Sega of America's impressive-looking sales numbers, they had somewhat overextended themselves in terms of the retailer deals they had maintained.
A huge problem came to light at Sega of America. In the American market, it was typically large retailers such as Toys R Us and Walmart that stocked game hardware and software. Those kinds of retailers would buy a huge quantity of stock at first. However, if they didn't sell the stock within a certain period, they'd send it all back. We'd have to buy it all back. SOA's profits in 1993, for example, were all washed away because it had to take extraordinary losses on returned stock later on. Those extraordinary losses came to 100 million or 200 million at a time. Furthermore, retailers in America held a lot of power, and they required manufacturers to have a certain amount of inventory on hand to replenish stocks when items sold out. For example, retailers required SOA to have at least 500,000 Genesis hardware units on hand to replenish sold stock, or they wouldn't do business with us. SOA had an excess of inventory that would all be sold at once, bringing in a huge amount of revenue. Then, all that inventory would come back from retailers later on, and SOA would take a huge loss. With the Genesis, all of those losses started to appear in 1994, 1995, and 1996. If you added up all the losses, the number would be astronomical. Shoichiro Irimajiri, MDShock.com.
You won't know what hit you. Tyco Jet Turbo Triple Wheel, $67.99 after $7 rebate, and Sega 32X adapts for 32-bit play, $194.99.
Sega of America by 95-96 was hurting pretty bad, and their sales model couldn't continue with the Genesis and 32X failing to sell, as it was causing retailers to return product en masse, causing huge losses for Sega of America, who on paper had looked like they'd been selling a lot, but as soon as the buybacks would happen, the company would hurt, and the 32X ran out of time. Retailers like Kmart sold the 32X for as low as $25 at some points. The system's library of games just wasn't enough of a draw to save the system in the 1996, and Sega ultimately was forced to abandon it, which is something many older gamers quote as saying the time they lost interest in Sega as a brand, as they felt somewhat betrayed by the act, as Sega had overextended themselves in terms of the systems they were supporting at one time, with the Game Gear, Genesis, 32X, and Pico and Saturn running concurrently. Sega just couldn't keep up, and worst of all, third-party developers couldn't keep up as well, as they saw Sega's split of the market as too risky for their games. It was a vicious spiral that drugged down not only the 32X, but every other Sega product. The 32X's failure effectively marked the end of Sega of America's autonomy, and sparked the beginning of a restructuring that forced out Tom Kalinske, Sega of America's then president, and resulted in a great deal of changes that altered the dynamic of Sega of America and Sega of Japan, where Sega of Japan took control of the operation, and Irimajiri eventually became president of Sega of America, closing that book in the chapter of Sega. Hey there. Thanks for watching the video, and if you made it this far, you're a true champion, or a true fan of retro, or you're a diehard fan of 32X like me. So, I appreciate you making it this far. This part of the video is going to be more of a editor's notes, kind of after the fact, just discussion pieces that I wanted to kind of cover and just explore and put out in the water that I'd love to talk to you guys about. Mainly, this has to do with 32X, and the conversations I'm having here are just points I wanted to talk about after the video was done. The number one I want to talk about is, did the 32X deserve better? I think yes. Despite its shortcomings as a stopgap, the 32X was a unique idea, where it was probably the only time in console history you could buy something that improved the performance of your console and theoretically extended the console's lifespan. And never again will such a feat be tried and be oddly pro-consumer. I mean, granted, you had some graphical improvement things later, like the expansion module for the N64, but kind of not the same thing in terms of this offered quite a bit more power and performance and capability on your base Genesis. However, no is also an appropriate answer. As for the time when it came out, it was kind of a crazy idea in the face of looming next-generation consoles. But still, you have to give Sega credit for having at least the balls to try something that had never been tried before. So it has that going for it. But yeah. And then another one would be, could the 32X have been successful? And probably not. Because the biggest thing I found when looking into the entire strategy of the 32X even existing, it was built around the Saturn not being available for at least a year, and the 32X allowing Sega of America to use a large install base of Genesis owners. When the plan changed and Sega launched the Saturn early, it completely derailed the plan. If Sega had waited on the Saturn release, I think you could have seen something fundamentally different. However, it just wasn't the case, and the 32X was just left to flounder with the what if of like, hey, the Saturn's just around the corner, why would I even waste my time with this? So it's really a victim of the time. And did the 32X reach its full potential? No, I feel like it fundamentally didn't at the time. Because as what we're seeing now is that the platform is getting ports of Tomb Raider and Doom. And these are allowing co-op play and rather impressive things that, had the console gotten that at the time, it probably would have been not necessarily game-changing, but something that really made the console more attractive. Where, because of the compressed development schedule of the 32X, developers and people working on it just didn't have the time needed to get these games together and out the door. And especially with a console that only had a functional lifespan of about 2 years, it really just didn't work out. But the 32X, I think, is a fascinating piece of gaming history that I think deserves more attention and not necessarily the hate it gets. But it's something that's fundamentally interesting and just fun to talk about and explore. But I want to thank you guys for watching Historic Nerd today. Hope you have a wonderful evening, day, or night, or whatever it is you're doing. Bye.